If the Renaissance could be said to have had a battle cry, it was ad fontes, back to the sources. To the mind of many thinkers of that period, culture and its vicissitudes had undergone a long period of degradation under the influence of Gothic barbarity and scholastic obscurantism. It was therefore the task of the day to recover truth and beauty at their ancient and therefore most pure sources. And in the 1460s, one of those sources was thought to have been rediscovered. And a manuscript bearing a tight, though legible, Greek minuscule hand appeared to be primordial wisdom stretching back to the most remote antiquity. Indeed, the source of all wisdom itself. The task of rendering that Greek into Latin was given to the extremely talented scholar Marsilio Ficino. And most famously, he interrupted his own translation of Plato's complete works to take up the task. Ficino, only in his late 20s at the time, began the work of translating what he believed, and many at the time also believed, was the teaching of the sages of all sages, perhaps the teacher of Moses himself, the arch-philosopher and hierophant Hermes Trismegistus. The texts Ficino produced have become the backbone of what we now know as the Corpus Hermeticum, the collected wisdom and teachings attributed to the thrice great Hermes. These texts have gone on to become synonymous with Western esotericism and mystical insight itself. But just what are they, and what do they actually teach? Are they indeed the font of all wisdom? In this episode of Esoterica, we're going to provide an introduction to the Corpus Hermeticum. We're going to explore the teachings found in these texts, explore their history, and talk a bit about how one might go about studying these texts in greater depth. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. When Ficino's Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum hit the incunable presses in 1471, it was an immediate success, going into some 24 editions over the next 150 years. The text was heralded as the uncorrupted font from which flowed the biblical teachings of Moses, but also Greek philosophy. In Hermes Trismegistus, Jerusalem and Athens had a common parent. But just what is this literature? The Hermetica is somewhat artificially divided into two camps by modern scholars. On the one hand, there's the technical Hermetica, which includes a wide range of literature including alchemy, astrology, botany, magic, and so forth, all ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples. This literature had an enormously long half-life and survived through the Greco-Egyptian period, into the Islamic period, and into the early medieval European traditions. Perhaps the most famous instance of this literature is the so-called Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, a text produced during the Islamic period. Sadly, most of this literature hasn't been given a treatment in contemporary scholarship, but I'll be doing a separate episode just on the technical Hermetica at some point in the future, so stay tuned for that. On the other hand, there is what is called the Philosophical Hermetica. Ficino rendered 14 brief tractates. The original 1471 edition was so slim that it could be bound with other texts. And this represented the lion's share of the body of the Greek philosophical literature traditionally ascribed to the legendary magus Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great and his disciples. So now that we have some categories, let's go ahead and just mess those up. What should be stressed at this point is the difference between the technical Hermetica and the philosophical Hermetica is anything other than rigid. It's a basically modern construct that doesn't fit easily upon ancient writings. For instance, the Alexandrian philosopher Zosimos of Panopolis glides easily between the technical Hermetica and the philosophical Hermetica in his writings on alchemy, proving that ancient peoples don't really give a damn about modern scholarly categories. Further, and more to the point I think, I find this distinction problematic because it allows modern prejudices to sneak into scholarship. While the philosophical Hermetica have been given a proper scholarly treatment, much of the technical Hermetica still languishes in obscurity. I suspect this reflects a bias to what is perceived as scholarly and respectable. In this case, philosophy is seen as respectable, whereas the world of astrology, alchemy, and magic are seen as something otherwise. Therefore, the Academy allows for the publication of philosophical texts, but is still profoundly prejudiced against the others. Of course, scholarship should be scholarship, and to my mind, we should give both equal weight. Regardless, these two categories are still somewhat helpful, even if they are fundamentally problematic. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing primarily on the philosophical Hermetica. As we have it now, the Corpus Hermeticum is made up of about 20 principal Greek tractates, a longer text in Latin called the Asclepius, a digest of definitions preserved in Armenian, a couple of brief texts that were recovered from the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, fragmentary tractates preserved in the teaching text of Stobaeus, along with numerous shorter fragments and testimonia preserved in writers from the late classical period and beyond. To be sure, what has come down to us is only a fraction of what surely must have existed, and has passed through what I call the Byzantine filter, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. A clue to how much has been lost may be found in the Nag Hammadi library. There we have a scribal note disclaiming themselves for not including more Hermetic literature, because they weren't sure if the compiler wanted them. There's an important lesson here, and that lesson is simple. Just assume that everybody wants more Hermetic literature. Not counting what's been lost simply to the vicissitudes of time and chance, the Corpus Hermeticum has also passed through what I call the Byzantine filter. What I mean by that is Greek texts passed through the hands of Byzantine editors at some point, and it's quite clear that those editors had a very complicated relationship with the Corpus Hermeticum. It is likely that the texts that have come down to us are the ones most amenable, or at least offensive, to Christianity. Indeed, Christianity has had a long, complicated relationship with the Hermetica that I'll be discussing in just a moment. And lastly, what's come down to us doesn't seem to have come down to us systematically. It appears that the Hermetic texts were graded based on some initiation process that is now unclear to us. What we now possess seems to be texts at various, seemingly random levels of this process. So it's unclear how these texts should be read, in what order, or even after what kind of initiatory or revelatory experiences. Despite all this, what unifies the texts is that they are based around the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples. As early as Herodotus, Hermes is linked with the Egyptian god of magic and writing, Thoth, and this relationship had become concretized by the period of the Greek colonization of Egypt. What emerges in the Greco-Roman Egyptian context is a heavily syncretistic culture, and by extension, a syncretistic religious worldview. This syncretism can be seen in many registers of Egyptian life at this period. Perhaps one of the most dramatic is to be found in the magical practices of late classical Egypt. I've made an entire separate episode on the Greek magical papyri if you're interested, so make sure to check that out as well. It is this context in the first few centuries of the Common Era that produced the texts of the Corpus Hermeticum as we know them. The combination of Hermes and Thoth was a natural fit, and the epithet, thrice great, seems to have an ancient Egyptian pedigree. The Philosophical Hermetica are typically structured as discourses between Hermes and his pupils, though Corpus Hermeticum I is taken to be a discourse between divine nous, or mind, and Hermes Trismegistus himself. The content of the discourses range enormously despite their relative brevity, from the nature of the cosmos to the origin and nature of evil, to the process of change, the nature of the mind and the soul, the very origins of the cosmos itself, and most importantly, the process by which one can achieve salvation. Sometimes a single tractate may cover several of these topics only in a couple of pages. The best theory we have as to the origins of the text is that they began as brief sentences, much like the wisdom literature of the indigenous Egyptian culture. And around these sentences grew a history of learned exposition. These discourses, as I mentioned earlier, were probably part of a system of graded lessons, for initiates passing higher and higher to what seems to have been the goal of the Hermetic philosophy, the salvific unification of the initiate's mind/soul with the divine mind or soul that is the ground of being itself. Indeed, the Corpus Hermeticum reminds me a bit of the Upanishads, both in style and in content. The worldview of the Hermetica is difficult to reconstruct, but let's give it a try. They appear to have held that an androgyne divine mind begat the cosmos, sometimes called the second god, or logos, and in turn created human beings, which are seen as both divine and non-divine, given that they are both composed of perishable matter and imperishable soul, or mind. This is basically a monistic worldview, although some antibody dualism does appear from time to time. The apparent task of the initiate is to ascend through the planetary spheres, through both ethical purity and mental contemplation, until reunited with the divine oneness, which seems in some sense possible while still in a physical body. This importantly separates the Hermetists from the Gnostics, who are typically held to be radical dualists, viewing the physical world as fundamentally evil and in need of escape. Importantly, the Hermetic practice was not only philosophical, but also sensible and empirical. One begins one's ascent by recognizing the beauty of creation as the work of the Creator, who is beauty itself. Since the divine is immanent to the cosmos is, by extension, eternal and filled with intelligences, gods, and daemons, who all act as part of the cosmic harmony through sympathetic relations. Evil is fundamentally thought to be a privation, insofar as the divine is the sole source of goodness. Death is thought to be simply physical dissolution, with life and mind being eternal. As the Corpus Hermeticum reminds us, the one is in all and all is in the one. In addition to these philosophical beliefs, it is also clear that they're what we would now call religious practices, such as the tradition of Egyptian statue animation, religious meals and kissing, the singing of hymns, and possible mantra-like chants to aid the initiate, some of which survive in the Corpus Hermeticum. This is also why I'm somewhat remiss to refer to these purely as philosophical Hermetica. From a strictly philosophical point of view, these texts aren't terribly extraordinary for their time. Virtually all of the philosophical heavy lifting in the Corpus Hermeticum seems to basically be ideas that can be found in Middle Platonism and the Middle Stoa. It's also clear that the Hermeticists are borrowing from Jewish sources as well. This is unsurprising given the enormous Jewish diaspora in the city of Alexandria at this time. Of course, the problem here isn't with the Hermetica, it's with us. In the ancient world, philosophy carried with it a much more robust sense. It was certainly more than simply justified true beliefs arrived at by rational argumentation, but rather it was a total way of being in the world. Philosophy was a way of life in the ancient world. What makes the Corpus Hermeticum extraordinary, and what may also explain many of the internal inconsistencies, lack of logical rigor, and apparently superficial treatment of highly technical philosophical problems, is that the priority of the Hermetica is soteriological. That is to say, it has to do primarily with salvation rather than producing a rigorous philosophical system. This is philosophy in the service of salvation. And to misunderstand that priority is to fundamentally misunderstand the Corpus Hermeticum. This may also help us understand how much of this religio-philosophical culture was a result of indigenous Egyptian influence. While a previous generation of scholars felt that the indigenous Egyptian influence was marginal, maybe just window dressing, recent scholarship has shown that at the literary level, a great deal of Egyptian idiom survives, but also much of the overtly religious practice probably has its origins in religious temple culture. Further, and I think this is also very important, anti-Greek language sentiment is preserved in the Corpus Hermeticum, ironically in Greek, and a prophecy about the dangers of colonialism is preserved in the Latin Aesculapius. While the Corpus Hermeticum is a result of a cultural syncretism, it also contains a protest against the reality of both Greek and Roman colonization, occupation, and appropriation. And this is to me what is fascinating and impressive about the Corpus Hermeticum. It produces a worldview by combining Egyptian religious practice with Greek philosophical speculation to produce a synthesis that must have been truly innovative in its time, if only a minority movement. Sadly, we're left with a very one-sided glimpse of this movement. At least part of what they thought has survived, but how they practiced seems to have been largely lost to history. So how did these essentially pagan texts survive the rise of the monotheisms? Well, surprisingly, because of them. As you may know, Christianity had a bit of a PR problem early on. It was a new religion. And new and religion made very little sense in the Greco-Egyptian Roman context. Religions were, by definition, old. Even Judaism, a religion the Romans held with a great deal of suspicion, still demanded respect because of its perceived great antiquity. But the Jesus movement, with its leader not only crucified, but crucified like last week, only made the religion appear more aberrant in the eyes of the average Roman. So many early Christian theologians and writers sought to link the coming of Christ with ancient figures and texts. And one such strategy that emerged, such as that found in Lactantius, was to link the coming of Christ with the Corpus Hermeticum, thus making Hermes Trismegistus a kind of pre-Christian Christian. This may also explain why the Corpus Hermeticum survives primarily in Eastern Christian centers. Was more amenable to Hermes Trismegistus, the Western writer Augustine was certainly not. This, at some level, given the great influence of Augustine in the Western Christian world, sealed the Corpus Hermeticum's fate in the Latin West. Until, of course, our great hero Ficino comes along, so back to him. As I mentioned earlier, the 1471 translation of the Corpus Hermeticum was a splash and ran into 24 editions by a century later. Further Hermetic writings were discovered, and Hermeticism enjoyed a kind of renaissance all its own, in the thought of people like Giordano Bruno and Ludovico Lazzarelli. Interestingly, the ideas of the Corpus Hermeticum do not have seemed to have had a huge impact on Ficino himself. The Hermetic seed of the existence of an ancient perennial philosophy, or Prisca Theologia, would survive Isaac Casaubon's solid argument that the Corpus Hermeticum dated to the first few centuries of the Common Era, and therefore could not be that ancient primal source of wisdom. Of course, people aren't going to let facts get in the way of the truth, and so move the origins of wisdom east, and then to Atlantis, and then through the Akashic records, or to the collective unconscious. Needless to say, the Corpus Hermeticum has had a singular impact on the development of Western esotericism, though less, I think, in its actual contents, but more in its metonymic value. The Corpus Hermeticum represents ancient, perennial wisdom, the dream of a spiritual monism to combat the dualism many of us perceive, and the ascent of the soul to the unity of being itself. That the Corpus Hermeticum has had a symbolic rather than literary impact may be especially true given that recent scholarship has shown that Ficino's Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum was profoundly flawed. So much so that subsequent editions tried to fix his Latin translation, only further confusing the text and separating its readers from the original Greek text. The mystery of the truth is almost always more powerful than the truth behind the mystery. If you want a solid understanding of the philosophical components of the Corpus Hermeticum, you're going to have to do a little work. To get a handle on this material, the main sources you'll need are Middle Platonism and Middle Stoicism. Here the main figures are probably Plutarch, Numenius of Apamea, and Philo of Alexandria on the Middle Platonism side, along with Posidonius and Panaetius on the Middle Stoicism side. John Dillon's book on the Middle Platonists here is essential reading if you really want to grasp the Corpus Hermeticum and all of its philosophical complexity. Now this may be somewhat controversial, but I don't see much in the way of Neoplatonic influences directly on the Corpus Hermetica itself. This would make some sense given the time period in which it was composed, especially if you think it was composed more on the closer side to the turn of the Common Era rather than later. For instance, the monad in the Corpus Hermeticum is a begetter or creator god rather than an emanator deity, and there really isn't much in the way of the kind of Baroque hypostatic entities that one detects in later Neoplatonic ideas. And to my knowledge, Plotinus himself only mentions Hermes once in the entire Enneads, despite him being born and philosophically and religiously trained in Egypt. So while Neoplatonic ideas have had an enormous impact on later Western esotericism, I don't think they're to be found natively in the Corpus Hermeticum. Of course, if you want to study the Corpus Hermeticum, the standard text is by Copenhaver with its very fine introduction and wonderful commentary. There's also a second wonderful volume out with the Armenian definitions, the Stobaean fragments, and more, although unfortunately, while still in hardback, it is prohibitively expensive. One hopes that a more affordable softcover edition will emerge soon. I'd also recommend the translation entitled The Way of Hermes. It's a bit less pricey than the Copenhaver edition and includes the Armenian definitions. Further, it has a slightly more literary quality to it that I appreciate as well. So perhaps I would pick that one up first. Among the best studies of the Corpus Hermeticum are those done in French by Festugière and Mahe, and this would also include the modern critical editions with Latin, Greek, etc. So if you're going to do all the work of learning Armenian, Ancient Greek, and Latin, a little French isn't going to be that difficult. The best study of the Corpus Hermeticum in its historical and cultural context is the wonderful study by Garth Fowden, which also contains analysis of both the technical and philosophical Hermetica, a very important study and well worth the purchase. The Arabic Hermes by Kevin von Blottel is also a very important text tracing the importation of both the philosophical and technical Hermetica into the Islamic context. For instance, it's in that context that we first see the appearance of the famed Emerald Tablet. So if you're interested in the development of that world, this text is incredibly important. If you're interested in Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, mysticism, magic, and the occult, make sure to subscribe. This is all core content here at Esoterica. I'd also hope you would support considering Esoterica on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.